Hi, this is Kelsey, and in this video we're going to be reviewing major events and themes of Period 3 for the APUSH exam. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but as an overview, and it should point you, hopefully, in the correct direction. So let's start off, of course, with the French and Indian War. This is by far the most significant turning point, particularly between the colonists and Great Britain. Why? Well, this is going to end the period of salutary neglect when the colonists were basically left to themselves and, of course, developing this sense of identity and self-government. And why this also is going to be significant is once this ends, the British are going to be demanding payment for protection during the French and Indian War. From the British perspective, they are protecting the colonists from the Native Americans. From the colonial perspective, well, they weren't all that impressed with the British performance in the French and Indian War. And they're going to say, well, we participated in this and we should, not have to pay for protection. And this is going to be a major point of contention. It's also somewhat significant because France is going to be extinct from North America. And what I mean by that is following the Treaty of Paris, they are no longer going to inhabit any lands in North America. And keep in mind that the colonists following the French and Indian War have this desire to expand out west. And this is going to be a bone of contention, particularly when the Native Americans are going to form an alliance and they're going to attack colonial settlers along the Appalachian Mountains, and this will be known as the Pontiac's Rebellion. This is going to create the British to enact legislation that will create what's known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, which bans Western settlement by colonists, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So with that said, the path to the Revolutionary War, certainly as we talked about in the previous slide, this idea that the British are demanding payment from the colonists is going to be a major bone of contention. We have the Navigation Acts, which of course existed, but now they're going to be enforced. This is a great example of mercantilism. You have other taxes on sugar, and particularly the Stamp Act on major documents is going to be a major problem for the colonists as they're going to boycott. They're going to be engaged in creating congresses. And then following its repeal, you'll have the Townshend Act, and it sort of replays the same idea that there's another new tax, and what do you get? Of course, the colonists are going to be upset. You have the Tea Act. You have even the Quartering Act, and that's part of our Third Amendment today that prevents soldiers from being housed into a citizen's house. You also have the Intolerable Acts that, of course, will follow the Boston Tea Party. So you have a number of different pieces of legislation, many of them economic in nature. Keep that in mind that in many ways this was an economic revolution as well as a political one, the idea of self-government. But how the colonists are going to try to defeat many of these acts is through the boycotts. So there's going to be something known as the association where the colonists are going to come together and again breeding this idea of unity amongst these 13 distinct colonies where they're going to plan out boycotts, and that's going to be a very successful and dominant strategy. They're also going to come together and form these congresses. So when the Stamp Act was enacted, you're going to have colonies coming together and forming these Stamp Act congresses. You also will have the First and Second Continental Congress. And again, even though we're at the Second Continental Congress, at this point, nobody's unified, at this juncture to declare war against the British. It will certainly take a little bit more time. And nevertheless, there's also going to be the means of propaganda. We see this in the Boston Massacre, particularly with that depiction. It's not so much of a massacre, particularly since the colonists sort of started it. And then you have the use of writing, the pen being mightier than the sword. You see the Committee of Correspondence, that being used to transmit important information through writing. And then, of course, you have Thomas Paine's very influential Common Sense. It's one of the most disseminated publications at this point that, again, is going to breed unity. So if you ever got a question on unity, these would be very important points to bring up. You also have the Sons of Liberty with respect to Sam Adams, certainly tarring and feathering many of the tax collectors and certainly causing a lot of problems in that regard. So certainly keep in mind these major acts as well as the colonial reaction to them, but certainly many involved creating unity. Now, the path to the Revolutionary War, at no point do you have a majority of colonists being patriots, supporting this idea of independence. You still have a sizable number of loyalists. And even during, after the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, you even have an attempt to broker peace. Of course, the king is going to laugh at the colonists in that respect. But nevertheless, at no point are the colonists 100% unified. So some of the major battles, as we know, Lexington and Concord, where the first shot heard around the world, is going to really set a lot of these events in motion. Breed's Hill is in particular important because it's going to be a moral victory that had the colonists had more ammunition. They certainly could have fended off the British. New York is going to be a major setback. If you recall that the British are going to invade into New York by sea and land, with the Howe brothers pushing the Continental Army not as far back as past the Hudson River, but as far back as the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And Washington, knowing that he needs a moral victory, is going to use Trenton and Princeton to utilize that. Again, suffering another setback in Philadelphia. But the really big idea here, Saratoga is going to be that turning point because it's going to impress the French with respect to the will and the might and the grit of the Continental Army. So the British are going to regroup and move their strategy south, and it's going to be particularly successful in Charleston and Georgia. But they will get some pushback at the Battle of Cowpens from the Continental Army, and of course this comes to a close in Yorktown with the assistance of the British. But again, keep that in mind. And you do have the Declaration of Independence that's going to be given to King George III, which is going to be very much irate about that. But of course, this is finally the last straw following all of this. So again, keep in mind, it takes a long time, even with the Olive Branch petition, to come to this idea that, hey, we're going to finally go away and declare our independence. So at the end of the war, Treaty of Paris will be established. This is going to extend the U.S. boundary as far west as the Mississippi River. Keep in mind that the Americans love the idea of expanding west. So the Americans win. Really big idea here that the French are absolutely important. You have more of a desire and will on the American part. They also know the land. And the British Empire is very much overextended. They are in debt, and they don't have as much of a willpower to win this war as compared to the Americans. Now, with this idea of expanding out west, if you recall, as we covered this before with the Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation Line of 1763, also instilling some anger amongst the colonists, but this idea of expanding west was nothing new, particularly with the Articles of Confederation, as they're going to include the Northwest Ordinance, which allows the new country to expand west. Also, states are going to be making land claims out west, so you'll see this, for example, Connecticut is making a land claim in present-day Ohio. You also will see treaties with Native Americans. Amongst the earliest treaties with the Native Americans is the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, as the Iroquois are going to be forced to cede some of their land. Even in the 1790s, you'll see this theme, again, repeating itself, particularly in the 1800s. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, you have the Treaty of Greenville. So again, this whole idea is the colonists are moving west at the detriment of the Native Americans. But we do have this new nation. The Articles of Confederation are our new first constitution. It has a lot of problems. No president has no national court system. States can coin their own money. It's just a major problem. And this problem becomes very evident following Shays' Rebellion, when the farmers rebel and the national government cannot put this down. They don't even have the power to tax. They can't raise a military. So the Founding Fathers regroup in the Constitutional Convention in Pennsylvania, and they come out with two basic plans. The New Jersey plan, which is going to give representation to the states that's equal. And smaller states, of course, are going to favor this, compared to the Virginia plan, which favors larger states based on, and it's more proportional with their representation. So certainly, they're going to take the best aspects of both plans and create what's called the Connecticut Compromise. That's a system that we have today, with the House being based on population, the Senate being equal. And of course, you have the 3/5 compromise that's going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. What's going to be instrumental in getting states to ratify this is going to be the Federalist Papers, 85 essays advocating why the colonists do not need to fear a stronger central government. And most importantly, the anti-federalists, who are from relatively smaller states, are going to demand a Bill of Rights. And that is ultimately what's going to push the needed 9 states to ratify or make legal this new constitution. So once we have the new constitution, we have two visions. You have Hamilton, who represents the Federalists, who will become the Federalist Party, wanting a loose interpretation of the Constitution, advocating for a national bank, wanting more of an elitist type of vision as well, compared to the Jefferson, who will eventually represent the Democratic Republicans. And for Jefferson, this is going to be having a country that's based on more agriculture instead of commerce and shipping like Hamilton. It's going to have a strict interpretation of the Constitution and representing more of the average person. But we will see that regardless of the vision that's being put forth, the new nation is going to be dealing with foreign affairs, negotiating a treaty, the Pinckney Treaty with Florida. That's going to expand that boundary to the west. Negotiating the Jay Treaty, which is going to evacuate the British from the forts out in Ohio. And then even staying clear of the French Revolution. So these are going to be some very important times for the new nation in terms of handling foreign affairs. Now, Washington, as the first president, when he gets elected, is going to actually be unanimous, the only president to ever win all electoral votes for an election. But in his farewell address, and this is sort of indicative in his presidency, he's going to strive for unity, talking about the importance of being united regardless of one's background, right? We're all American. He certainly puts forth that point. He's also warning against the danger of political parties. You're going to see that between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Also, this idea of neutrality with other nations. They should only be in commercial relations only. And again, the fact that the Constitution is there, it must be adhered to for this nation to work. I highly encourage you to read that, should you not have, because this is a hallmark document for this exam. So our second president will come in, John Adams, and this is very much indicative of sectionalism. Notice how the countries are voting for completely different people based on sections of the country. You're going to have problems with France, the XYZ affair. We're basically in an undeclared naval war known as the Quasi-War with France for a few years. But kudos to John Adams for still remaining somewhat neutral in the sense that he does not have Congress declare war against France. But one of the more controversial things that is going to happen with the Federalist Party is that they're going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are going to be very much discriminatory towards Democratic Republicans, saying that, for example, you can't say anything malicious about Congress or the president. Certainly an infringement of one's First Amendment right. And the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions passed at the state level are going to try to cancel out these acts at the national level. Keep in mind, these are states. They're nullifying national laws. That can't happen under the supremacy clause of our Constitution. It's going to be the first act of nullification. Well, guess what? This idea of nullification is going to happen right again come the Civil War. So keep that in mind as we plug further along. And that's where we will end this Period 3 overview, but certainly I encourage you, if you have any questions that are left over, to really go back and look at these events, as this is not meant to be an exhaustive review.